Well, hello everybody. Welcome to our lecture today on Chapter 8, Early Childhood Biosocial Development. I've divided this lecture into 4 different sections. We're going to cover body changes, brain growth and development, motor skills development, and then complete a section on health hazards for young children. First of all, let's talk about the body changes that occur during the early childhood period. Children become slimmer, which is usually represented with a lower body mass index or BMI. And as children go from the age of 2 to 3, you'll notice that their belly, their face, and their limbs all seem to get a little bit longer. In fact, each year from age 2 through age 6, which is in general the early childhood period, we see that well-nourished children add approximately 3 inches in height and gain about 4.5 pounds. So this is a significant time for physical growth and development. The center of gravity also appears to move from the upper part of the chest down toward the belly. So as children become 3 to 4 years of age, they're no longer as top-heavy as they were when they were toddlers. During early childhood, it's really important to pay attention to nutrition. In fact, most children in developed nations get enough calories, some more than enough, but they still may not get enough critical nutrients such as iron, zinc, and calcium. Many customs in different cultures will actually include unhealthy foods and entice children to indulge in these, and some customs are associated with more weight gain than other customs. So for example, in the United States, in December, when there are a lot of holidays in the Christian and Jewish traditions, we see some weight gain in children, which is typical of the population. In general, there are some correlations between gender, ethnicity, and overall income with body fat, and some of these go in a direction that you may not anticipate. So for example, females tend to store more body fat at different ages. Individuals with Hispanic background may gain more weight at certain times of their lives, but actually do not have adverse health outcomes at the rates that are associated with weight gain in non-Hispanic populations. And we do find that individuals who earn less money per year tend to have less access to nutritious foods and therefore tend to actually have more body fat related to consuming less healthy foods. One of the concerns for many parents is regulating the amount of sugar that young children consume. It can be a major problem depending on the culture and the customs of the culture. In general, pediatricians and the American Heart Association recommend no more than about 6 teaspoons every day of different kinds of sugar. The possible negative effects of sugar are primarily in the dental area. It's tied to cavities, can also create some metabolic issues where the body begins to crave more and more sugar, and that can lead to weight gain that is not nutritionally healthy and can set the child on a dietary trajectory that could be problematic as they get older. Interestingly, while individual parents may report that they see their son or daughter becoming more hyperactive once they've had some sugar, studies of children as a group have not demonstrated this effect to hold. And you will read pediatricians describing that sugar is not supposed to change behavior in children. However, some individual children may respond with a burst of energy that is difficult for parents to contain. In general, healthy nutrition is pretty important in the early childhood years because it helps to set up the body's physiological metabolism. In other words, how quickly a person will be able to break down nutrients and sugars and carbohydrates. So early childhood obesity can lead to difficult outcomes later on. Focusing on the preschool years, particularly for children at risk for obesity, and teaching them healthy eating is thought to be a really important aspect of preventative public health, and some of the encouraging changes that we've seen in childcare settings, in schools, and in parent education have helped to reduce the obesity rate in children over time. You'll notice here that we've also learned some more about who is at risk for childhood obesity. Children growing up in families who have fewer socioeconomic resources are at greater risk, oftentimes because their communities may not offer the kinds of nutritional food that children who come from more wealthy families are able to access. These areas are often referred to as food deserts. And what they mean is they may have shopping available, stores available, but lack fresh vegetables and fruits, which are really important for a young child's growth and development. Another aspect of risk can come from children who are raised by relatives. In particular, studies have found that children raised by grandmothers tend to maybe be loved through food, but tend to be at a greater risk of obesity. And individuals who come from other countries where their systems are not quite used to the diets here in the United States may find that they gain weight quickly once they begin eating in the manner of the United States diets. Young children who go through stress in a chronic or ongoing way are at particular risk for developing obesity. Not only may these stress hormones change the way we metabolize food, but they impact sleep, and sleep is an important regulator of weight gain, it turns out. And many children experiencing stress may overeat if they are allowed to because of the self-comfort that that can provide. So we need to think about the physical health of young children who are also going through emotional duress, as those two things can really influence each other. And then lastly, as far as risk factors go, we want to be aware that many parents need some education about how important it is for a young child to get started with a healthy diet. Dietary patterns in the early childhood years tend to last across adulthood, so those patterns that are set into place kind of predict an individual's long-term trajectory when it comes to healthy nutrition. Another aspect of body changes that occurs for preschoolers is that this tends to be the time of onset of allergies. Approximately 3 to 8% of preschool children are allergic to a variety of things, such as cow's milk, soy, peanuts, or fish and shellfish. These allergies can range anywhere from being a mild concern, maybe a sniffle or a rash, to a very significant health concern, perhaps respiratory distress or even a seizure. Now, the diagnostic standards for allergies really vary. And oftentimes, if a child's experiencing ongoing symptoms, a pediatrician will request an allergy test in order to identify what substances should be avoided. Now, in general, if allergies are mild, the treatment recommendation is usually to stay vigilant and avoid having the child ingest substances with the allergen. However, if an allergy is more severe or more likely to come up pretty often, in other words, it's difficult to avoid or contain the child's access to what makes them a little sick or a lot sick, then the pediatrician may decide to order what's called medically supervised small increment exposure. This procedure involves, under a doctor's orders, giving the child tiny amounts of exposure to what they are allergic to. By having these tiny amounts given to them on a very specific and regimented schedule, the young child's system will respond by developing the antibodies, and the immune system will respond by tamping down some responses and increasing others until these little inoculations of the allergen resolve in the child no longer having an adverse reaction to what initially made them allergic. It's also important to keep in mind that allergies can often be outgrown over time. In some cases, they increase with age. In other cases, they decrease. So it's really up to the individual family to decide if medical intervention is necessary or if they want to take that more preventative avoidant path. So while body changes in overall body fat and nutrition and that sort of thing do change over time in early childhood, another really important part for us to consider are the changes in brain growth and development. By age 2, a child's brain weighs about 75% of what it will in adulthood. There's a lot going on in brain development during this time period. There'll be extensive connections being made between axons and dendrites. We refer to that as sprouting. There will also be the editing of connections, which we refer to as pruning, when those repeated connections are edited out in order to create a more efficient neurological structure. The brain then reaches approximately 90% of its adult weight by the time the child is 6 years old. Now, brain growth is a very complex aspect of human development, and we've talked about different aspects of brain growth in other classes. During the preschool years, we begin to see more and more development of the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of your brain right behind your forehead, actually, above your eyes, that is going to help an individual to control and regulate his or her behavior and to be able to understand the behaviors of others, understand the social expectations, and be able to kind of connect the emotional sections of the brain with the communication sections of the brain. So in general, think of the prefrontal cortex as like the conductor in an orchestra. We may use the term executive functions to talk about all the different things this part of the brain takes care of. The prefrontal cortex grows a lot during the preschool period, primarily because of changes in myelination. You may recall that myelination involves the development of that sheath or insulation that goes around neurons and allows connections from neuron to neuron to move more quickly and efficiently. And it has been shown through lots of studies that changes in myelination in the early childhood period is what makes a 6-year-old, let's say, answer a question a lot more quickly and with a lot more nuance and complexity than a younger child. So the development of the prefrontal cortex is a very important part of what's going on in early childhood. The prefrontal cortex will continue to develop over time and actually isn't fully formed until approximately 18 to 24 years of age. A few other parts of brain development that are important for us to consider are the corpus callosum and its role in the lateralization of the hemispheres. So the corpus callosum is that long, thick band of fibers, might be referred to as white matter, that connects the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain and facilitates communication back and forth. If there is a thinning of the corpus callosum, in other words, those fibers are not well developed and aren't providing the kind of connectivity that we need to see to have both sides of the brain talking to each other, then one of the possible outcomes could be an autism spectrum disorder or other learning conditions. In a healthy brain, if one side of the brain is injured, the other side can often take over that task or the task that the first side usually did, and thus the two hemispheres need to be connected to be able to help a person recover from injury as much as to help them to process things efficiently. So health of the corpus callosum, that band of fibers that connects both sides of the brain, is pretty important. And the early childhood years is when those hemispheres really start to get better and better connected up. One of the ways that you will notice this connectedness is that you do start to see what we call lateralization in the early childhood years, and this is where each hemisphere of the brain begins to take on specific functions, so that the left side of the brain tends to control the right side of the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And during this time, we see preschoolers beginning to show a preference for either being left-handed or right-handed. Now, many times, both sides of the brain, and thus both hands, are often involved in many skills, but in general, cultures have preferred right-handedness for lots of reasons, some of which have to do with early religious thought, where the left, which is Latin for sinister, was associated with the devil. But it turns out there is no superiority to being left-handed or right-handed. It's just that through practice and through kind of what the parents and teachers and adults around a child often are encouraging, a child is likely to develop a preference for one hand and continue to use that hand in things like handwriting and other small fine motor tasks. But in actuality, none of us is exclusively left-handed, exclusively left-brained or right-brained. We all are using all of our brains all the time. So as the prefrontal cortex is maturing from infancy through adulthood, we see increases in the areas of the brain that relate to higher reasoning and thinking. And we refer to these as what's going on in the cortex areas, that part of the brain that is at the top of your head and handles those higher functions. Those include things like planning, conceptual thinking, social awareness. In fact, as we get more and more neurological control in our prefrontal cortex, sleep becomes more regular. A preschooler is more likely to sleep in regular hours as opposed to a toddler. You may notice too that a preschooler's emotional system becomes better regulated. Temper tantrums aren't likely to last as long as they did in the so-called terrible twos. And uncontrollable laughter, crying for no reason, which is normal in 2-year-olds, is much less likely to be observed in preschool-aged children. So as the brain matures, so does the emotional, social, and cognitive functioning of the young child. Planning and analyzing are skills that are noted to be particularly active in their changes during the preschool period. Young children are better able to focus their attention, more likely to be able to stop themselves from behaving impulsively, and less likely to repeat the same thing over and over again, like their younger selves used to enjoy doing. That emotional regulation that I mentioned is often learned through practice, but also supported by developing connections between the emotional system, your limbic system, and your behavioral regulation system in your frontal lobes. While the brain is developing in early childhood, we have to be aware of things that may throw that development into a more negative direction. So one of the things that can constrain brain development in the early childhood years is chronic and persistent stress on the young child. Now, this is going to really vary depending on the age of the child, how frequent and how intense the stress is. So having some manageable stress, such as learning a new skill, not really getting it, but having to keep trying, that kind of stress is actually very healthy and good for a child and will help the development of thinking. Some of the hormones that are released when we are under challenge actually help to focus our attention. Athletes and those that perform at high levels will often talk about this, that they are actually at their best when they are under the stress of competition. But if a young child has too many stress hormones flowing through their system, that can result in permanent damage to brain pathways. You can end up with a less efficient learning system because of chronic stresses early on, but you can also see far-reaching effects in their social and emotional development, as we'll talk in future chapters. So overall, there needs to be a balance in early childhood between having some arousal or some stress and also experiencing enough reassurance that the child develops optimally. I'm going to pause at this point to double check our sound, and this ends part 1 of Chapter 8.